Welcome back to Lantern Control. Today we're going to be doing a bit of a different style, fun video. We're going to be ranking every deck in Modern based on how good of a matchup it is for Lantern. So kind of how happy will you be to see certain matchups to, how much are you going to never want to run into certain matchups. If we look at our tier list here, our best tier is a buy, where this is essentially a deck that we are almost always going to win against. They have very little play against us, whether that's because their deck strategy just lines up very poorly against us, or they don't have interaction for artifacts. Any of that sort of stuff is going to go into buy. Heavily favored, we're probably looking at about 70%. So buy is probably like 90% of the time we win. Heavily favored is going to be like 70 to 90% favored. We still win, but they have maybe a bit more game against us than some decks do. Slightly favored is going to be ones where we'd expect to win a bit more than we lose, but we're not like shocked if the opponent wins the matchup. 50-50, obviously this is going to be our close to the middle matchups, games where a lot of the result is going to depend on who draws what. Unfavored is just going to kind of be the whole range of matchups where I think we should go in facing an uphill battle. And then go home is going to be our worst of the worst matchups, like it's the reverse of a buy. So why don't we get started here with Rakdos Scam. They're kind of loosely ordered by how popular they are in Modern right now, based on the Goldfish page. So loose rankings, and then as we get later, we're not going to go through all of them. Some of these ones at the bottom are pretty fringe, but our ones here. So if we take a look at Scam, and I think the old versions of Scam would definitely be in heavily favored. I'm going to put it in slightly favored, but I think it's definitely more, it's more than 55%, probably looking somewhere between 65 and 70%. I would expect our win rate against Scam would be. Yes, they have some fast starts that they can get off to, but we also play hand disruption. We have ways of disrupting the Grief Scam. They don't have a lot of answers to a main deck Ensnaring Bridge. Shieldred is kind of the one card seeing play now that drops this down a bit, but it's not terrible. I would put Pre-Ban in heavily favored. I think that was a very good matchup for us. Rhinos, they have a lot of hate, but we also have a lot of answers to them. This might be wrong, but I'm going to put it in heavily favored. I think it's one of our better matchups. It definitely feels like they have interaction for us and they have ways of disrupting it, but overall, we can still, our bridge is very good against them, and we can grind them out of cards very, very effectively. Yawgmoth, I'd say, is a bit unfavored. Maybe it's 50-50. We'll go conservative and say unfavored, but it's probably somewhere in the low 40s, I would guess. We have Curse Totem, obviously helps against them a lot. However, they do have a good number of ways of searching their library. They have a lot of, and they are a combo deck that has kind of their combo line, but then they can also just beat us down with efficient creatures. So they have multiple angles of attack, but overall, I think we can still do pretty well against them. Murktide, I think this is, again, one of our better matchups. Ragavan can be a problem. I'd say most of the games that I lose usually are because Ragavan hits something that is bad for us, whether that's a well-timed Thoughtseize, they get their hands on a Codex Shredder, anything like that. But if we are able to, play if you hold Thoughtseize until the turn before you're going to play Ensnaring Bridge and then get a bridge down, they don't really have any answers to it. So I think overall we're pretty favored there. Amulet Titan, this is a go home matchup. It is probably our worst matchup in Modern. This is going to be the top of this tier. They have so many answers to everything we're doing. They're so fast. We don't our deck lines up extremely poorly against them, and just not a good matchup. Living End, I'm going to put it in unfavored. Some people might want to put it in favor, but I actually find that with how many cyclers they have, especially in their post board games, that unless we if you're playing surgicals, it's more favored. So maybe I'll put it in 50-50 to account for the different matchups. But it oftentimes feels like you get them in a position where they're locked, but then you can't mill every cycler because they just have too many of them. And then so eventually you get into a position where they have too many cyclers in hand, and you really need a lot of mill rocks to lock them. So it's kind of a I think I'm happy with it in 50-50. Green Tron, this is going to be our another go home matchup. We have, you can maybe win the odd match against them, and I've won games against them before, but it requires a lot to go right in order for that to happen. Karn the Great Creator is very good against us, just shuts down our entire plan, and they can often be fast, and they will usually overwhelm our Pithing Needles, is often how you lose, where you might have a needle on Oblivion Stone, Karn Liberated, Blast Zone, and then they draw like Beseiju or something, or you have it on Beseiju and they draw Blast Zone. And then once they remove one needle, kind of their other cards that we have needled allow them to remove all the other needles, allowing them to break out of the lock and just overwhelm us. Also playing the One Ring, like they have way more than 4 targets to needle, so can be a very difficult matchup. Continuing to move along, here we got 4-color Omnath, and we're going to put this in the unfavored category. I would say this is harder than Yawgmoth, but it's definitely a stage earlier than Titan or Tron, as it is a hard matchup. However, we do have some good sideboard cards for them. Additionally, Urza's Saga can put a lot of pressure on, and especially without Beanstalk now, they don't have a ton of ways of drawing cards, so there's fewer threats once we have the lock established that we have to worry about. Hardened Scales, I'd say we're slightly favored. They can be very fast, so against some of their fastest draws, we are going to run into problems. Agatha's Soul Cauldron can be pretty good with that. But for the most part, I think we can usually bridge and a needle or two. This is importantly one matchup where bridge needs to be totally empty, so zero cards in hand, and that can sometimes cause a problem, but overall we're probably slightly favored. Burn is going to be somewhere between, we'll go slightly favored. They can have fast draws that can really get there. However, no, we're going to move this up to heavily favored. I think Urza's Saga there are so many games that I've played where Urza's Saga just totally solos Burn, where it feels like I played Urza's Saga, I made 2 constructs and found the Underworld's cookbook, and they can't win. So if they don't have an answer to Saga, it often feels like they just lose. Like I've had so many games where like I make 2 5/5s, so all their creatures can't get through, and I have cookbook, and it's like turn 3 where I have these 2 5/5s. Turn 4 I'm able to gain 6 life in that turn, and they can't come back from that at all. Cabal Coffers, I think this is an interesting matchup. I'm going to put it in 50-50. They run some Thoughtseize effects, which can obviously disrupt us, and then Karn the Great Creator and Shieldred are kind of their 2 main threats. We have Needle for the Ring, so we're not too worried about that. Bowmasters we don't really care about. All of their Fatal Push, kind of all their removal for the creature decks is largely blank against us, so they have fewer threats to resolve. However, if they get those threats through, it's definitely hard to come back from, and they do, similarly to Tron, they have the power to overwhelm us pretty quickly. Hammer Time, I think this is a favored matchup. We bridge very strong against them. I'm not moving it up to heavily favored because I think they can still have those turn 2 kills that you're like, if you don't have the exact kind of piece of removal or the hand disruption, they can kill you on turn 2 or turn 3. However, once the lock plus bridge is set up, like they're very unlikely to draw out of it. There's not many cards that are relevant. Kind of Forge Anew is kind of the only main one, but they do play Ornithopter. Maybe slightly favored isn't the exactly correct word. Maybe we'll just put it in as favored. Indomitable Creativity. I think we're unfavored here. A lot of obviously creativity, being able to blow up bridge is quite strong, but they're very consistent. They have a good mix of counter magic plus kind of leyline binding. They can do Ren and 6 Beseiju loops. However, they also can often run into trouble against us if we're able to strip their one or two main threats out of their hand. Like we can sit behind bridge and just never let them draw creativity. So we have probably they're a bit favored, but we still have a lot of play in the matchup. Domain Zoo. This is a heavily favored matchup. Pithing Needle on Beseiju and Ensnaring Bridge game 1 I think takes care of that, and game 1 they lack a lot of answers. Game 2 they'll have a bit more, but I say Tribal Flames is the only real card that we care about where it gives them pretty good reach, but for the most part it's a pretty good matchup. Mill, we are pretty unfavored against Mill. They have even something like Leyline in the sideboard does a lot less against them than it used to. They're because of the prevalence of Commander, so many decks are kind of focused, or so many cards are printed as each opponent instead of target opponent. Tasha's Hideous Laughter, if it ever resolves, usually takes about half our deck. Obviously, that's not what you want to do against Burn. And the whole Ensnaring Bridge plan, because they're not attacking on that angle, just not really what we're built to deal with. There are like Elixir of Immortality and cards like that can be good against them, but overall, Mill... honestly, I'd say Mill is probably worse than these three decks here. Merfolk, we're heavily favored. Like one Thoughtseize Needle Ensnaring Bridge beats them game 1, and Thoughtseize Needle Ensnaring Bridge also usually beats them game 2. They don't really, like, their only answer to a resolved bridge is Odawara, as they're playing blue, Hercule's Recall in the sideboard. We do have a few more answers to worry about. They can kick Tide Shapers or play Spreading Seas to deal with Urza's Saga, but it's not the end of the world. And then Vodalian Hexcatcher and Force Negation are the only two cards we really care about from them, but again, it's not, neither of them are, like, we can Thoughtseize both of them. Death Shadow, and I will say, like, there was a time when Merfolk was a buy. We're not in that time anymore. They've printed more answers, but like 3 years ago, Merfolk was a buy for us. Grixis Shadow, probably the top of favored. They're very similar to Murktide. I kind of want to put Shadow and Murktide together, as I think they play very similarly, where they're trying to deploy early threats and then back them up with counter spells, a bit of interaction. Death Shadow maybe slightly slower deploying its threats, but overall still that same play pattern where if you can resolve a bridge, it becomes much easier to protect it than it is against a lot of decks, and I think we're well built to force that through. Next up we have Jund Saga, and I think this is a pretty 50-50 matchup. We have a lot of good cards against them. They also have a lot of good cards against us. So I think it is a very draw dependent game where both players have a lot of decisions to be made, and I find honestly Jund Saga games are very interesting. Kind of the mirror of both players playing Saga, especially if you're playing Haywire Might. Always the push and pull of, do I put a needle on Haywire Might? Do I use my Haywire Might to exile their Saga? A lot of very, very interesting dynamic there. Next up we have Twiddle Storm, and this is a deck probably slightly favored. However, they do often get to see a lot of their library. If you have something like Grafdigger's Cage, that's obviously going to be very powerful against them. They don't have a ton of ways of interacting with that, and a lot of our discard is going to be very, very strong against them. Next up, Goryo's Vengeance. I think it's slightly unfavored. They have a lot of card selection in terms of playing things that draw cards and discard in order to fill their graveyard, or like put Emrakul into the graveyard at instant speed, which does mean that even once we have them locked, they're still able to see a lot of cards, and they play numerous draw twos in the deck, which are always a problem for Lantern, giving us a draw that we can't play around. If they have turn 2 Emrakul, we're in trouble, but once Ensnaring Bridge comes down, we're not as worried about the reanimation, more so just their ease of finding cards like Leyline Binding, which are quite strong against us. Prowess we are favored against, but not as much as Burn. Prowess is harder for us to play against than Burn, as they rely more on creatures, and Burn is more reliant on direct damage spells. I would say one thing I didn't mention about Burn is that less decks are playing Eidolon now, which was a very strong card against us, so that improves our win rate even more. Prowess, obviously a lot of creatures, and then usually they'll have something like Underworld's Breach to top out their curve, which definitely gives them an extra leg of reach. I've also seen Prowess lists playing Prismatic Ending, which is quite strong against us. Dredge is very good. It's not a matchup that I play against much. I'm kind of debating between heavily favored and Buy. I think I'll put it near the top of heavily favored. Buy is a pretty rare tier. We don't have a ton of those matchups, but Ensnaring Bridge is very strong against them, obviously, so puts us. It's a very good matchup. Grinding Station is not a very good matchup for us. Us loading their graveyard also gives them access to a lot of what they're trying to do. And I think similarly to Titan, where they kind of have two angles of attack that are both very strong, where they can either go for Ragavan DRC attacking that good tempo plan, or they can go for the combo quickly. And having that double line of attack is usually good against us, as many of our hard matchups rely on kind of having two main ways of winning. Next up is Scape Shift. I'm going to put it around 50-50. I think especially if you're on Surgical, like the Assassin's Trophy lists definitely do better against them than some of my more Prismatic Ending based lists, as Trophy is very good against Valakut. I think they definitely 50-50. Affinity, we're pretty favored against Affinity. Always been a pretty good matchup for us, just with Ensnaring Bridge. Usually their kills don't come before we're able to land a bridge, and so we're usually in good shape. And despite them playing a lot of draw twos, usually we can just let them draw cards. It's not a huge deal. Thopter Sword, we're probably favored against them. Pithing Needle's quite strong, obviously, and Ensnaring Bridge shuts down a lot of even shuts down their combo lines, so I will take a favored matchup. Boomer Jund is, I mean, it's kind of a Jund thing to put it in 50-50, so I guess I'll do that. We're probably in favored, but because it's Jund, I'll put it in 50-50, just because that's the Jund stereotype of every matchup is a 50-50. Belcher is going to be our first buy, especially post board. Playing so much hand disruption, being able to take their lands is very powerful. If you play something like Assassin's Trophy, you can just destroy their lands. We have Needles, Leyline, Spellskite, all sorts of tools that are very effective against Belcher. So I'd say overall Belcher is one of our best matchups, and definitely of the buys, it's probably the one that's going to see play the most. There's only a few on the list, but the other ones are not very common decks. Goblins, I mean, I personally play Hushbringer, which is extremely good against Goblins. They do have some combo lines you have to watch out for, but Goblins is a good matchup. Death and Taxes, I think we're unfavored against. With cards like Urza Saga, Profane Tutor, Leonin Arbiter is very good against both of those. Thalia slows us down significantly. Ghost Quartering we're not good against decks that want to blow up a lot of our lands. So it's an unfavored matchup. We can still win with the right draws, but I think they have enough hate pieces to target us effectively. Sam combo, likewise, I think this is an unfavored matchup. they have the good combo line, and especially if they even get like one Sam on the battlefield and Academy Manufacturer, they just have so many cards that enable them to spit out so many tokens. And then once they get all these tokens, like the clues, they can effectively negate our locks so that they're able to draw through anything we might want to keep them off of. And yeah, they're a very strong deck. Ad nauseum, we're pretty favored against them. They're a very linear deck. Our hand disruption is very good against them. Overall, a good matchup. Mono Black Burn, I'm going to put together with Boros Burn. I think they play very similarly against us and have very, very similar matchups. If anything, the Black Burn might be a bit better, as a card like Pithing Needle is relevant against something like Gonti's Mechanicians, where we can shut down a bunch of their bolts as they're a bit slower, but very, very similar to Burn. Boggles, this is another buy. It doesn't really see much play anymore, but they basically have no answers to Ensnaring Bridge. Yes, Boseiju got printed, and they might play Stony Silence in the sideboard, but they're just singleton cards. They don't have a lot of ways of drawing extra cards. Just a very good matchup. Similarly, Calibrated Blast, I think, is also one of a very strong matchup. Our combination of hand disruption, we have Grafdigger's Cage for graveyard, mainly just our hand disruption and then being able to keep them off it a second time. Additionally, we don't usually do too much damage to ourselves, so the most they can hit off one blast is 15, meaning we kind of have to cast like 2 Thoughtseize and use a Pain Land for one of those, and I don't think it's too likely that we don't have many games where we cast 2 Thoughtseize and they still are able to get a blast off early. Dicetron is an unfavored matchup for us. Karn the Great Creator is very good against us, obviously, and they just have a lot of... they can get low to the ground very quickly, so if we lack that early interaction, we can definitely get put behind very quickly. Now, Eldrazi Tron is probably our one favored Tron matchup, where they're more focused on spitting out big creatures, aiming to, play Eldrazi that are bigger than the creatures a lot of other decks are playing. But we're totally fine with our opponents making big creatures, as Ensnaring Bridge is pretty good against that. On the Hollow One, I'm going to actually give us the unfavored. I think game 1, Ensnaring Bridge is very powerful, but in post-board games, between their Blood Moon effects, along with they usually play some number of Ancient Grudges, which we don't have great answers to, and just the unpredictability of the matchup, where we can have games where we discard all our lands, games where we get left with tons of lands in hand. I wouldn't say it's like super unfavored. It's maybe up here. If we were going to order these a little, I think Mill and 4-color are down here. Grinding Stations, probably something like that, with Hollow One being not terrible, maybe around 43 to 45%. Heliod, I think we're favored against this. It's Pithing Needle very shuts them down, which we like to see. Infect, I mean, yes, they can get us on turn 2. Blightsteel or Inkmoth Nexus, I'll put it closer to the upper levels of favored. I think I'd rather be playing against something like Merfolk than something like Infect, as it is going to really punish the hands where we're relying on. If we're relying on something like Profane Tutor in order to play Bridge, like if we don't just have it naturally, and if we don't have our hand totally empty, they can often attack for 1 and then pump at instant speed. Timulus Amulet, I think it's around 50-50. I think it is very interesting how much better it is than regular Amulet Titan. I don't know exactly why. It just feels like maybe it's just a bit slower, or it's more vulnerable to hand disruption. Often it can make a lot of mana and then not do a ton if we have needles on the right targets. Whereas Amulet Titan, if they're resolving Titans, they're always doing something, something powerful, no matter what our lands are on. Neoform, I'm going to give this 50-50. I think it's very play draw dependent, as if we're able to turn one Pithing Needle or turn one Hand Disruption, our hand is a lot stronger. Whereas if they're on the play, I mean, they have like turn one wins or even some of their turn two wins. So I think very, very play draw dependent. In terms of Reanimator, I think this is going to fill a similar space as Goryo's Reanimator. This just being the traditional Esper shells, where again they have a lot of draw twos, ways of cycling through their deck, and which cause a problem for the lock. We are able to shut down lots of their graveyard things, but they still kind of have enough ways of impacting the board, and often play a good mix of counterspells to Fairy Leyline Binding that it is a lot for us to deal with. Elves is not a deck I see very often, but I guess we're pretty favored against them. And again, Ensnaring Bridge really does a lot, and even things like Curse Totem in the sideboard really help out. Getting to the last couple here, Storm. I think, yeah, we're probably favored against Storm. We have enough disruption early. They can be weak to Thoughtseize effects. Yeah, I think we're pretty well positioned against Storm. The Rack, I think, is... I mean, I haven't played against the Rack in a while, but it's likely a buy. They don't... When we play Pithing Needle and Liliana, they don't really have any way of making us discard lands other than that. So we're able to just hold lands in our hand, and then, if we're hiding behind an Ensnaring Bridge with 3 lands in hand, like they're not really attacking with much. Even if they make constructs off Urza Saga, they will be bigger. So we can just hold the lands in hand, never take any damage off of their racks, and then we're just in a very good position. And finally, Lantern is a nice 50-50 matchup right there. Overall, looking at the tier list, I definitely think we have more favored matchups than unfavored matchups. However, this is a pretty wide swath of Modern, so if you look at kind of how popular the matchups are, obviously some of the best ones, Scam, Murktide, Rhinos, Scales, we have good matchups against. They're in the more favored side, but then things like Amulet Titan and Tron, I think the fact that these two decks both make up significant portions of the meta, like almost 10% are basically like nearly unwinnable. We're probably somewhere between like 10 to 20% against them. So the fact that that's 10% of the meta, that's in the last 30 days. If you look in the last 7, fairly similar, holding around 10% of the meta combined between Amulet Titan and Tron, which obviously not great if 10% of the decks just auto win against yours. If you have a 55% matchup against everything else, but then you take off 10%, well, now you're under 50-50. So I think it's unfortunate. We kind of are going to be looking at ways to improve both of these matchups. I think the Amulet Titan one is the one that I'm more interested in kind of finding new ways of combating it. But it's definitely a hard one. If you look, Yawgmoth is also very common, which isn't a great matchup for us, and 4-color. So if you take like Yawg, 4-color, I think it gets a bit less of the meta just because of how expensive it is. But between Yawg, Amulet Titan, Tron, and Yawgmoth, you're looking at anywhere like around 25% of the meta is contained in those 4 decks. It is somewhat balanced out by another 25% of the meta being Scam and Rhinos, but if you have 25% being really bad and 25% being reasonably good, overall still not a great recipe. This is where I think Lantern is positioned. Hopefully you enjoyed this a bit of a different content than what we're used to, but just trying to keep a bit more exciting things going on the weekend. Hope this helps, and you'll be a bit more prepared as you enter matches with Lantern Control.